I paced around the kitchen, unable to shake the sinking feeling in my gut. The dinner I had meticulously prepared lay untouched, the candles flickering in the dimly lit room. Tomas sat across from me, an unreadable expression on his face. A fresh start for her? What about us? I demanded, unable to contain my frustration any longer. Elsie has always been a disruptive force in our lives. Tomas sighed deeply, running a hand through his tousled hair. She's family, Leona. My sister needs our support after losing Mark. Support? Or a chance to wedge herself between us again? I knew Elsie's manipulative ways all too well, the scars from her past meddling still fresh in my mind. Tomas's brow furrowed. That's unfair. She's been through a lot. I couldn't believe he was defending her so readily. And what about what we've been through? The strain she's put on our marriage time and again. His jaw tightened, and he avoided my gaze. Maybe this time will be different. I let out a bitter laugh. You know better than anyone how she operates. She'll use her grief as an excuse to undermine me with the kids, just like before. Tomas's eyes flashed with irritation. You're being paranoid, Leona. She needs a place to stay, and we have the means to help her get back on her feet. I shook my head vehemently. Not at the cost of our family's well-being. You know how she'll try to turn the children against me, just like she did with you. Tomas slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. Enough. I've made up my mind. Elsie is moving in, and that's final. The finality in his tone cut me deeply. I searched his eyes for any hint of the man I had once trusted implicitly, but all I found was a stranger, blinded by misguided loyalty to his sister. As the silence stretched between us, I realized that this was just the beginning of another battle, one that would test the very foundations of our family. And this time, I knew I couldn't let Elsie win. I returned home from my business trip, exhausted but determined to reason with Tomas once more. However, the sight that greeted me in our living room shattered any semblance of hope I had left. Elsie sat on our couch, her legs crossed, sipping tea as if she owned the place. Miles and Eliza huddled near her, their eyes lit up with adoration. A look I hadn't seen directed at me in weeks. Welcome back, dear sister-in-law, Elsie cooed, her saccharine tone grating my nerves. The kids and I were just catching up. I clenched my jaw, fighting back the urge to lash out. I see you've made yourself at home. Tomas emerged from the kitchen, his expression apologetic. Leona, we need to talk. Talk? You went behind my back and brought her into our home without my consent. I gestured towards Elsie, who feigned innocence. Tomas held up his hands placatingly. She had nowhere else to go. I couldn't turn her away, not after everything she's been through. Elsie nodded solemnly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's been so difficult, Leona. I'm grateful to have family like you and Tomas to lean on. I scoffed at her crocodile tears, seeing right through her act. Cut the dramatics, Elsie. We both know you've been waiting for an opportunity like this. Elsie's mask slipped, her lip curling into a sneer. Maybe if you were a more attentive wife and mother, Tomas wouldn't have felt the need to bring me in to help. Tomas looked taken aback by her words, but Elsie pressed on, her voice dripping with venom. Face it, Leona, you're always too preoccupied with work to truly appreciate the wonderful family you have. I felt a familiar sickness twist in my gut as she expertly manipulated the situation, planting seeds of doubt in Tomas's mind. The children watched on, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the toxic atmosphere in the room. As I met Tomas's conflicted gaze, I knew this battle had only just begun. And this time, I vowed to expose Elsie for the venomous snake she truly was, no matter what it took. In the days that followed, Elsie's presence became increasingly suffocating. She slithered her way into every aspect of our lives, her influence spreading like a noxious weed. Tomas, have you noticed how little time Leona spends with the kids? She would say, her voice laced with false concern. They seem so starved for attention. Tomas would shift uncomfortably, glancing my way with a hint of doubt in his eyes. I wanted to scream, to remind him of the countless evenings I sacrificed to attend Miles's soccer games or help Eliza with her homework. But Elsie's poisonous words had already taken root, and she knew just how to twist the knife. And her job? Does she really need to work such long hours? A family should come first, don't you agree? Tomas's jaw would tighten, and I could see the conflict raging within him. My income might have been lower than his, but it was essential for our financial stability, a fact Elsie conveniently omitted. As the days wore on, her digs became more pointed, her barbs sharper. You know, Tomas, if Leona contributed more financially, you wouldn't have to work yourself to the bone. I wanted to lash out, to remind her that her own financial woes were the reason she had leached onto our family in the first place. But I held my tongue, knowing that any reaction would only fuel her twisted game. Elsie would then turn her attention to the children, showering them with affection and attention, a stark contrast to the subtle neglect she accused me of. Miles and Eliza, innocent to her machinations, basked in her doting, their admiration for their aunt growing with each passing day. As I watched my once tight-knit family slowly unravel, I knew I had to act fast. Elsie was a master manipulator, and if I didn't expose her true colors soon, she would succeed in tearing us apart for good. I thought I had reached the depths of Elsie's treachery, but she proved me wrong in the most devastating way possible. One evening as I prepared dinner, I overheard Tomas and Elsie whispering in the living room. Their hushed tones immediately set off alarms in my head, and I strained to make out their words. "Think it's for the best," Elsie murmured. Leona's struggles with her mental health could jeopardize the children's well-being. My heart plummeted as I realized the gravity of their conversation. I inched closer, my hands trembling. "But to grant you guardianship rights?" Tomas sounded hesitant. "That's a big step." Elsie's voice took on a soothing tone. "I know it's difficult, but we have to prioritize Miles and Eliza. You know how unstable Leona can be." My breath caught in my throat as the full weight of her words sank in. She was trying to strip me of my parental rights, using my past battles with anxiety and depression as ammunition. "I just want what's best for them," Tomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course, dear brother," Elsie cooed, "and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." I backed away from the living room, bile rising in my throat. Elsie had crossed a line, and in that moment, any semblance of sympathy or understanding I had for her evaporated. As I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter until my knuckles turned white, a cold fury settled over me. Elsie wanted a war, she would get one, and this time I wouldn't hold back. I made a silent vow to myself that Elsie's twisted schemes would never see the light of day. No matter what it took, I would protect my children and my family from her poisonous clutches. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. It was time to fight fire with fire. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile, biding my time as I gathered ammunition for the inevitable confrontation with Elsie. I knew I needed to tread carefully, lest she catch wind of my plans and spin her web of lies even tighter. Finally, the opportunity presented itself in the form of a family dinner. As we all gathered around the table, the tension in the air was palpable. Elsie, ever the actress, plastered on a saccharine smile, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. "It's so wonderful to have us all together like this," she gushed, her eyes shining with false sincerity. A true family meal. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from lashing out, focusing instead on the carefully laid plan. "Speaking of family," I said, my voice deceptively calm, "I couldn't help but notice some discrepancies in the paperwork you filed after Mark's passing." Elsie's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, dear." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "The life insurance claim you filed? The one where you pocketed the entire payout meant for your children?" Tomas's head whipped towards Elsie, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Elsie? What is she talking about?" Elsie's mask slipped, revealing the ugly truth beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Leona," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. I smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "I have the documents right here. Bank statements, insurance forms, everything you tried so desperately to hide." As I revealed the incriminating evidence piece by piece, Elsie's composure crumbled. Her face contorted with rage, and she slammed her fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. "You vindictive little snake!" she snarled, her carefully cultivated facade shattered. "You think you've won? This changes nothing." But as I met Tomas's stunned gaze, I knew the tides had turned. The veil had been lifted, and he could finally see Elsie for the manipulative, deceitful monster she truly was. In that moment, the seeds of revenge took root, and I knew there was no turning back. Elsie had made the mistake of underestimating me, and now she would pay the price. The aftermath of my revelation about Elsie's fraudulent activities hung heavy in the air like a suffocating fog. Tomas had barely spoken a word to me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. I knew I had struck a nerve, exposing the depths of his sister's deceit, but I couldn't bring myself to feel remorseful. Elsie had brought this upon herself, and it was past time for her twisted games to come to an end. As the days passed, the tension in our household only grew thicker. Elsie had retreated to her room, emerging only to shoot venomous glares in my direction. Tomas, caught in the middle, seemed paralyzed by indecision. It wasn't until a knock at the door one evening that the fragile stalemate was finally shattered. An investigator from Tomas's firm stood on our doorstep, a grim expression etched on his face. "Mr. Delgado, we need to discuss some disturbing findings." Tomas's brow furrowed as he ushered the man inside, his curiosity piqued. I trailed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. The investigator wasted no time, launching into a detailed account of irregularities discovered in Tomas's financial records, discrepancies in client accounts, unexplained transfers, and a trail of breadcrumbs that led back to none other than Elsie. As the pieces fell into place, Tomas's face drained of color. "No, this can't be happening," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. Elsie, who had emerged from her room to eavesdrop, let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, but it is, dear brother. Did you really think you could keep me out forever?" Tomas whirled around, his eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen before. You used me? All this time?" Elsie shrugged, her expression one of smug indifference. "It was simply too easy. A few well-placed suggestions here and there, and you were putty in my hands." As the weight of her betrayal crashed down upon him, Tomas seemed to deflate, the fight draining from his body. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and newfound respect. In that moment, I knew the tides had shifted irrevocably. Elsie's web of lies had finally unraveled, and Tomas could no longer deny the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that justice would prevail. With Elsie's misdeeds laid bare, the atmosphere in our home shifted dramatically. The tension that had once hung thick in the air was replaced by a strange, fragile truce, a temporary ceasefire before the final confrontation. Tomas avoided his sister like the plague, the shame and humiliation of her betrayal etched into every line on his face. Elsie, for her part, remained defiant, holing up in her room and refusing to acknowledge the impending consequences of her actions. As for me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The battle had been long and arduous, but I knew I held the upper hand. With the truth exposed, it was only a matter of time before Elsie's reign of terror came to an end. Finally, the day arrived when I could no longer delay the inevitable. Armed with a mountain of evidence, bank statements, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts, I summoned Elsie to the living room for a final reckoning. She sauntered in, her chin held high, a haughty sneer plastered on her face. Well, if it isn't the righteous Leona. Come to gloat, have you?" I met her gaze steadily, unflinching. "This isn't about gloating, Elsie. This is about justice." Tomas hovered nearby, his expression a mixture of trepidation and resolve. He knew what was at stake, and for perhaps the first time, he was ready to stand by my side. I laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, until Elsie's veneer of arrogance began to crack. "You have two choices," I said, my voice low and unwavering. "You can leave this house peacefully, or I will personally ensure that you face the full weight of the law for your crimes." Elsie's eyes darted back and forth, the panic finally setting in. "You can't do this to me," she spat. "I'm family." "Family?" I let out a bitter laugh. "You lost the right to call us that the moment you decided to tear us apart for your own gain." With a trembling hand, I pushed the final document towards her, a restraining order, already signed and legally binding. Elsie's face contorted with rage, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, a realization that her twisted games had finally caught up with her. As she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle was over, and I had emerged victorious. Not just for myself, but for the sake of my family. Tomas stepped forward, his gaze heavy with remorse and newfound respect. "Leona, he trailed off, words failing him. But I didn't need his apologies. In that moment, I knew that the foundation of trust had been rebuilt, and that we could finally begin to heal the wounds Elsie had inflicted upon us. It was a hard-won victory, but one that would shape the course of our lives forever. With Elsie gone, a sense of calm finally descended upon our household. The toxic cloud of tension and manipulation that had once lingered had dissipated, allowing us to breathe freely for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Of course, the aftermath of her betrayal was not so easily erased. Tomas spent countless hours on the phone with lawyers and accountants, working tirelessly to untangle the mess Elsie had created with his finances. The shame and guilt were etched into the lines on his face, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his willful blindness. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his commitment to making amends, not just with me, but with our children as well. He showered them with affection and attention, making up for the lost time when Elsie's poisonous influence had taken hold. As for me, I found solace in the knowledge that I had protected my family from a force that threatened to tear us apart. The scars ran deep, but with each passing day, the wounds began to heal. It was during one of our nightly routines, a simple game night filled with laughter and fond memories, that Tomas turned to me, his eyes shining with a newfound respect. "Leona," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I'll ever make up for the way I treated you, for allowing Elsie to blind me to the truth." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "You are the strongest, most resilient woman I know. Through it all, you never wavered, never gave up on our family, and for that I am eternally grateful." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "We've been through hell and back," I said, my voice steady. "But we made it. That's all that matters now." Tomas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I promise from this day forward no one will ever come between us again. You have my word." As our children cheered and the game resumed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief wash over me. The battle had been long and arduous, but in the end, love and loyalty had prevailed. Elsie's toxic influence was but a bitter memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when greed and manipulation take root. And as I looked around at the faces of my family, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before.